This is from the Better Speaker series, and it's really to give people the opportunity to expand speaking abilities in certain particular areas. This happens to be impromptu speaking. And I purposely came prepared with some comments for an outline, but I also wanted to see if I could pick up from some information from other speakers, because that's one of the opportunities that we have for impromptu speaking. Is really, it's like an expanded version of a table topics. It's basically a table topics on steroids. I'm a runner and a running coach, and I speak to a lot of people who run marathons. I happen to run what's called ultra marathons, and typically my favorite is the 100-mile distance. And people will ask me, marathoners will ask me quite often, well, Ed, I don't know how do you do that? A marathon, I'm so, after a marathon, so worn out. I cannot imagine doing an ultra marathon. But the reality is they already have the skill. They just need to change their pacing and they can get through a longer distance. Well, all of you have the skill to give an expanded impromptu speech. If you've given an impromptu speech, a table topics, you have the skill. What scares us is that timeline. An impromptu speech that's 5 to 7 or 10 to 12 or 15 minutes or longer, that's the scary portion of it, because how do we fill that? Well, in reality, sometimes it's easier to talk longer than less. This is attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but it's actually Blaise Pascal who said, I would have written you a shorter letter if I had more time. Winston Churchill said, if you want me to give a 30-minute speech, I can prepare that within a couple of days. If you want it to be a 3-minute speech, it's going to take me 3 weeks. Now I'm paraphrasing. Basically, the point is more difficult because you want to get to the point. Impromptu speaking is taking whatever comes at you, like music in the background, and figuring out how can you bring it into your speech and say, that was planned. Thank you. You came in right on cue. I asked you to come in right when I said the last words about Winston Churchill. You did, so thank you. I appreciate that. Impromptu speaking is really about taking a subject that you want to speak about and giving impact to your audience. This happens when there's a speaking spot available and either speaker doesn't show up or no one fills the spot. So this is typical of a Toastmaster meeting where the Toastmaster will come on and say, we have an opening. Does anybody want to give an impromptu speech or a pocket speech? And typically everyone's kind of cowering in their seats thinking, no, I'm not ready. I can't do it. Well, the beauty of giving an impromptu speech is we don't need you to be perfect. In fact, you don't have to be perfect in any speech that you give, obviously. We're Toastmasters, we're forgiving, we're understanding. We'll catch you when you fall. But an impromptu speech gives you the opportunity to expand, to stretch beyond what's comfortable. So if you're given the opportunity, take it. I have one of my clubs I'm a member of, they heard me speak 3 weeks in a row. Not because I took the spot on the agenda, it's because I showed up and there wasn't a speaker. We need someone to step up and speak. Okay, I'll speak. By the time I'd given a third speech, I think they're all ready. Anybody, please, can anyone speak except Ed? And so that's how I am. I'll take the opportunity. You give it to me, I'm going to take it. But you can incorporate what's already been given to you. It's a gift. In improvisation has what we call players. They're actors, but players. And improvisation is rarely done with a single person. There's multiple players because we give gifts to each other. And we accept, we don't block. So for example, in improv, if I were to say, the sky is blue, it's a beautiful day, and then someone takes over the storyline, no, it wasn't blue at all, it was gray and dark, it was a terrible day. Well, that's blocking. Instead, they would say, oh, the sky was blue and a beautiful day, but there was a rainbow with no clouds. I'd never seen that before. And that's the opportunity you have with impromptu speaking. You can get up and take the theme that the Toastmaster is given, or play off of something that's already been said. For example, David Forrest talked about what's in it for me. He said that's not what you do when you're a team player. when you're coaching others and also as part of a Toastmasters group? Well, that's something we look at when we give a speech is what's in it for you. Especially in an impromptu speech, you're looking for making an impact on your audience in some way. How many of you have actually given an impromptu, unplanned speech beyond the table topics? Let me see a show of hands. Okay, I see probably about a fourth, and I saw a thumbs up. Thank you there. Do you remember the very first impromptu speech that you ever gave in your life? Now, I asked that really kind of tongue-in-cheek because we speak impromptu every single day. The first words out of your mouth was an impromptu speech. You didn't plan it. Mama, dada, you didn't have any organized outline. You just spoke. We do that all the time, but when we get in front of an audience with a number of people, suddenly it's a scary adventure for us. I remember what I would call my first impromptu speech. I was running for 8th grade president. And I did what all candidates would do, trying to get a vote in the 8th grade. I will turn the drinking fountains into chocolate milk water, and we'll double recess, and we'll make sure the teachers don't give us any homework for the weekend. Promises that obviously I could never keep. Now, part of how I remember this being an event that actually wasn't such a good experience, I was slumped forward, my hands were shaking, I was sweaty, and I remember the shirt I was wearing. It had a roller coaster image on it. How do I remember this? Because it's now permanently in infamy, because in our 8th grade yearbooks, there is a picture of all the candidates for 8th grade president, and there's a picture of Eddie with long blonde hair. I had hair back then, slumped forward, looking kind of down, giving an impromptu speech. Now, somehow, out of all the other candidates for the 8th grade, and by the way, my class was only 28 students, somehow I got voted in, and my next speech in the 8th grade was the exact opposite. It was a scripted speech. I rewrote and rewrote and rewrote that speech over and over and over. I memorized it. It was rote speech. That's also not the best speech I've ever given in my life. Somewhere in the middle is what I do at this point. So taking what's been given to you as a gift and giving an impromptu speech out of it, you could take a subject and you can give pro and con. I can take C.F. Hawthorne's speech and give pro and con. I could also take her speech and say, you know what about bias and prejudice, and maybe find a story that ties into that and John's experiences with his dad. So that I remember, it comes to mind. Someone just reminding me about that. Yes, thank you so much. It's the airport story. Appreciate that, coming online there without being muted. They're reminding me about that airport story. The story of Tom. He's getting ready for a flight, and he has some time, and he goes to the airport, and there's Mrs. Phil's cookies, and he buys a half dozen of the small cookies, and he finds a spot waiting for his flight to be called and sits down to enjoy his cookies. And he takes a cookie out of the bag and eats it. And the woman sitting next to him reaches in and also takes a cookie, one of his cookies, out of his bag and eats it. Didn't even ask permission, just ate his cookie. And then he didn't want to confront her about this, so he took another cookie and ate that, and sure enough, she did the same thing. The third cookie that he ate, and then she took the last of the cookies, and at least she had the decency to break it in half and give him half of the cookie. But Tom could not believe this woman. Her flight was called, she got up, she left, she had designer luggage, she had really fancy jewelry. This woman obviously had money. Why did she need to be a cookie thief stealing his cookies? Well, Tom got onto the flight and was about to stow his carry-on the overhead. remembered he had bought a book at the bookstore. He wanted to read that during the flight, unzipped his carry-on, opened it up, and what was in his carry-on? A bag of 6 miniature cookies. He had forgotten that he had put that inside of his carry-on bag when he sat down next to this woman. He thought those were his cookies. Now, his prejudice towards this woman and the judgment he made about her, his reality was based on what he perceived to be true. Wasn't really true. But can you imagine this woman who knew those are her cookies getting onto her flight and telling everybody, you will not believe this young man. I sit down, I've got my cookies, and I'm ready to take the first one. He reaches in and takes the first one. I get the next one, he takes the next one. He didn't even ask me. Tell you about a cookie thief. 2 different perceptions from 2 different people's experiences. And you could say based on whatever biases that they may have had. Now, when you give a story in an impromptu speech, the bottom line is there has to be something that's in it for the audience, as David said. What's in it for me, or for the audience, what's in it for you? So what's the takeaway?
All right, when it feels fun.
That's correct. The takeaway, I just was reminded about that by our little bit of information right there. The takeaway could have actually multiple parts. You could have a fun takeaway, like when you go to buy cookies, how about buy 2 bags? You can give a bag to the stranger sitting next to you. And there could be another takeaway. And the takeaway could be, you tell me. Unmute and give me a takeaway based on what you've heard about Flores talking about teamwork, about CF talking about the ugliness of previous prejudice in our country, John's story about seeking alignment, and now a cookie story, a cookie thief. Could there be a takeaway that you could give to your audience to help wrap up your impromptu speech? I see a hand, Art Douglas.
Hi, thanks, Ed.
Yes.
My takeaway would be buy that extra bag of cookies because you can always benefit by doing something loving for somebody else. You might never see them, but they'll tell the story about you for the rest of their life.
I love that. That's a great takeaway. And if you can end any speech, I always feel like a great way to end a speech is always on a high note, end with hope. Help other people excel is an acronym you could use for hope. And Art just described that perfectly. You can always add some value, give someone something that they can talk about to everybody else that they encounter simply from a little story. And that's what I believe the core of impromptu speaking is about. Finding a way to take just information that's provided you, the gift that's given to you, making stories that you might have in the past. And that story, by the way, is a story that it's amazing how many speakers own that story. Zig Ziglar says it was his brother, Tom. In Chicken Soup for the Soul, they talk about that story. And there's other speakers who present that story as if it happened to them or someone that they know. The bottom line is there are stories out there that we can incorporate into an impromptu speech, and we could use that to make a point, to make an impact on others around us. And anytime you have the opportunity to give an impromptu speech, that's always a chance to stretch, to try something different, to try something scary. And what if you fall on your face? What if you give an impromptu speech and it doesn't quite turn out the way you expect? What's the worst that can happen from an impromptu speech? Simply, people around you can say, well, I think he could have done a better job. I think he could have made more impact. All right. But the reality is, if they weren't the one taking the opportunity to get up it's kind of hard to be the person to cast that first stone. And I've heard it happen, and it's very sad when this does happen, when someone gives an impromptu speech and their evaluator talks about how they came up with so little preparation. Well, that's an impromptu speech. You don't necessarily prepare. If you have some stories in your back pocket, that is great. And if you have a speech that you've memorized, that's not really an impromptu speech. Impromptu speaking is about getting out there, taking the opportunity, seeing where it goes, and trying to bring it to a place where you can bring impact to your audience. So I'm going to encourage all of you, the next time the opportunity arises in your club to give an impromptu speech, an unplanned speech, take the gift of what's already been given, what's already been said, find a story that's your own or one you've heard, and make an impact on your audience. And if you can, at the end, leave them with hope. Mr. MC.
All right. Thank you, sir.